We're getting on toward the end here. Talk about, so you have gene pool spread across an area. And while they all have access to each other, the alleles are spreading amongst the reproducers. This works for sexual reproducers. Some of this works for asexual reproducers as well. We talked about migration of a small subgroup off. Well, once the Native Americans were over in America, there, so far as anybody knows, was no backward travel. They did not send alleles back to East Asia. They became completely isolated from one another. And then as they went through the Americas, subgroups of that population became isolated from one another. And once you've got a small gene pool that's no longer mixing with the original gene pool, then it can change its ratios. Think of Hardy-Weinberg. If there's selection involved, working across the Americas, there's a lot of different ecosystems, so people moving into different types of environments than they came from. So now there's selection on traits that there wasn't selection on before. And so if you're looking for origination of species from ancestors, from shared ancestors, a tremendous driver of that separation is isolation. Even genetic drift can do that, right? Even if they move into areas where there isn't a lot of condition push to change, just genetic drift can produce species that are different enough from one another to be considered species. And then the question is, so we just talked about physical separation. This is called geographic isolation. And it can be moving to a different continent where it's not that easy to get back. It can be getting across a river with a small population, but the river itself is not that easy to cross. So the river expands and it separates two populations and makes them unable to breed. An area dries out, becomes essentially a desert, and splits a population into the two sides of the desert. In wolves in North America, wolves used to be essentially a continuous population from Florida to Western Canada. But with the advent of people, they've been separated out quite a bit. Also, on the fringes of that, the conditions are different enough that probably there were already subpopulations that were very close to being different enough to be species. And even now, what's the genetic definition now of a species versus a subspecies? Because there's that argument over whether the red wolf population of the southeast United States should be considered a different species or not. They're obviously very genetically similar to wolves. The semi-aquatic population off the coast of Western Canada, should it be considered a subspecies or a species? It's been isolated on those islands for a few thousand years, and definitely has some noticeable differences between them and the regular wolves of Western Canada, but are they different enough? But geographic isolation are physical barriers that separate out subpopulations. It's not the only way to do it. You can separate out populations that are living in the same area through the same time period. When a subgroup becomes more specialized for a particular job, the original green iguanas that got to the Galapagos Islands, there wasn't really an ecosystem, a rainforest ecosystem for the green iguanas, but there were ecosystems that iguanas could get by in. And over time, they become much more specialized for those. So you got the marine iguanas on the coastal rocks diving into the water and chewing algae off the rocks, and the upland iguanas chewing down on the tough deserty flora of the uplands of the Galapagos Islands, almost certainly derived from the same starting population of survivors that managed to get to the islands. So it would have been some selection on the survivors that would have given them some advantages once they got to these deserty islands. But you got a population, here's another example, population of day hunting raptors, birds, basically hawks. But, they're trying to catch prey all through the daytime. And the prey are, pretty good at spotting them and dodging them and doing all the other stuff that they do. Well, if you have a subgroup within the large group that has an allele combination that gives them better low light vision, they can hunt early in the dusk, late in the dawn, when the rest of the population can't really see that well. They're not out and about yet. It gives them advantage. The prey population can't see them as well either, so they now have a natural selection advantage, a survival advantage that can get more and more specific over time. But they become isolated from the main group because they're not active doing their thing at the same time, and the features that are useful to them are not necessarily useful to the day hunters anyway. And so over time, you wind up with a population that is so good, its dark vision is so good that they can actually hunt at night. Their hearing is better because it selects for better hearing. They fly quieter because now the prey have to focus on flap, 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 flap. And if your feathers are fuzzier and you don't make that much noise, then they can't hear you coming and they can't see you in the dark. And also, flap, 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 if you're gonna, as you come in, hear them scurrying and that helps you to zero in on them, hearing yourself is probably not that useful either. And so you wind up with a population that evolves into owls away from the starting population without having to be in a different place, to be in the same place but working at different times. And that's niche isolation, isolation into different jobs, producing different specialties, different adaptations, or focusing on different adaptations. In species that live in seasonal areas, then very often they breed at a particular time of year because there are advantages to doing that. What if you have a subgroup that hits its breeding period at the wrong time, but it can get by doing it? This applies a lot of times to plants, where a plant that would normally flower in May, you wind up with a mutation in some of the seeds, and they don't flower in May, they flower in July. Maybe that's terrible for them. Maybe they're dependent on certain pollinators that are not available in July and they can't pollinate. Or maybe they can't get their seeds up and ready before the winter hits and they can't get to the next season. But what if they can? Now you've got a population that is programmed genetically to flower at a different time. So it's only reproducing during that time. It is now no longer capable of reproducing with the other group that flowers in May. Now this happens in plants also because a lot of plants are self-pollinating, so they don't need two different flowers to have that mutation. They just need a population of seeds that can pollinate within themselves, or one flower that can pollinate within itself and throw a bunch of seeds out. As long as there's a survival possibility, you can get two now subgroups of what used to be the same species breeding at different times, which has different conditional pushes on the two groups, and they can become different strains of the same plant or eventually different species of the same plant. Happens in animals to some extent too, though it's harder to come up with examples of that. I'm going to write the rest of them down. The rest of them all mostly focus on sexually reproducing dioecious species. In some dioecious reproductive species, the males have to convince the females that they're worth mating with. And they produce a behavior. They may build something, they may bring a gift, they may do all sorts of stuff that says, look at how, outrageous I am and I haven't been caught by a predator. Isn't that great for our offspring, right? Handicap theory is that, this big peacock tail not only will be great for our male offspring, but I've been able to survive with this big thing on my back through to the point where I can reproduce with you, which means I have advantages our females are going to get as well. I'm stronger, I'm good at gathering resources, that sort of thing. But you sometimes get subgroups where the behavior choices split off. And what works for this subgroup doesn't work as well for this subgroup, and the behaviors start to diverge to the point where this group won't even recognize the other group in terms of their behaviors. And so now you've got reproductively isolated subgroups, again, in the same place. And what makes them different, like the birds of paradise, which are spread on just a few islands in the South Pacific. When you have different species on the same island, how did they diverge from their ancestors? Well, they do a bunch of different things. Mechanical is a weird one, probably only recognizable because there's a bunch of people who like to name new species of insects. It's been a hobby for a really long time. That's the only reason why there's more species of insects than other groups, and more species of beetles than other kinds of insects, because beetles are easy to catch and easy to look at. And what some people have found is that in the same ecosystem, you find what look like the same beetles, doing the same thing, reproducing the same way, except their genitalia are built in a way where the females of one subgroup cannot reproduce with the males of the other subgroup in the same area. They mechanically don't fit together, so they're mechanically isolated. This subgroup can no longer reproduce with that subgroup. Sometimes it's the only recognizable difference, but it does make them reproductively separate. Remember, that's the basic species definition. In its natural habitat, it only reproduces within its group. And so, and maybe eventually from genetic drift, you'd see differences in species, but you don't necessarily. And then a similar thing is that sometimes, this happens in plants, the chemical one, is that in order for pollen to work on a plant, the female part of the plant has got to interact with the pollen, allow it to make a pollen tube so the sperm can get down to where the egg cells are. Well, sometimes that interaction is a little dicey. There are times where it'll interact with pollen that isn't even its species, and so plants hybridize a lot more than animals tend to. But sometimes it'll be the right species, but some of the females just won't interact with the pollen and won't let it reproduce. They become this subgroup becomes chemically isolated from the rest of the pollen makers, because they'll only reproduce with pollen of a certain chemistry. And so now you've got this, again, exclusion going on. And in animals, sometimes it's a similar thing, but the response is immunological. You get an inflammatory reaction to some of the proteins generally in semen. And so females of one subgroup cannot reproduce with males of the other group. The inflammation keeps fertilization from occurring, keeps the sperm from getting to where the egg cells are, and that isolates the groups. Sometimes the examples are weird. Many years ago, there was a British, I think he was a banker, but he was an avid bird watcher to the point where he had a month off every summer. He had a cabin up on the coast somewhere, and there was a rookery there, an area where seabirds reproduced every year, same time. And he would spend his month walking amongst the nests, taking pictures, taking notes, naming, giving the birds different designations, to the point where he'd been doing it so long that he knew what bird this was, he knew who their offspring were, he knew who their parents were, he knew who their grandparents and their grandparents were. And one year, I'm assuming it was rainy and he didn't do as much outdoors, he decided to sit down and do a huge family tree of all of his different, see who was really distantly related to whom and stuff. And he found out that he had two completely separate breeding populations. That there were of this population never bred with this population and vice versa. And it had been true for as long as he'd been taking his notes. But he didn't know how or why they were different. They knew they were different, but he didn't know how they knew. But he had two isolated breeding populations. Now, he had no way of knowing how long this had been going on, but there wasn't enough genetic drift to make them different to a human observer. The birds apparently could tell the difference. And they'd go, well, you know, you're not in our group, so go away, buddy, sort of thing. So sometimes it becomes very mysterious. Okay, one other thing to sneak into the end of this chapter. We've talked about epigenetics. I'm not even going to write it down. Epigenetics originally was stuff that could be inherited that wasn't in DNA. What we now call memetics, things that like culture and territory and language, things that can be passed not just from parents to offspring, but within a group, inheritable things. And then at some point, it was discovered that doing evolutionary experiments on bacteria, you would change the conditions, and it would select out a few bacteria that had the right alleles to live in those conditions. And then you'd look at their DNA and find that the DNA hadn't changed significantly. It's like, okay, what the heck's going on here? But also they would find that, so you change the conditions back, you go 5 generations and change the conditions the way you had before, and they all are fine. It's like, they haven't changed their genes, but their ability to adapt to this change in conditions is carried on through subsequent generations. So first they're discovering they're not changing the DNA, they're changing what genes are accessible and being accessed. They're changing genetic expression. They're turning a gene on that allows them to deal with the conditions. Not all of them in the initial population were capable of doing that. But the modification they made to activate the gene became easier to use, so that 5 generations removed, you change the conditions back, they just doink, and they just activate that gene and are fine. And so epigenetics shifted from non-DNA related but inheritable things to DNA related that weren't code specific. Changes that could be inherited that weren't changes in the DNA code, but changes in modifications of the DNA code that we will talk about later. They have little molecular clips that you put on and take off to gene promotional stretches that allow you to either turn the gene on or turn the gene off, but also can make it easier to turn the gene on and turn the gene off. And now things that used to be called epigenetic are called memetic, like memes online where you're passing this stuff around. Okay, that is, let me double check. That is the end of that particular chapter.